January, what role did QAnon play in the insurrection at the Capitol building?
An enormous role. I think it is arguable that if QAnon didn't exist, the Capitol insurrection may not have happened or may not have been as well populated. The two are completely intertwined. For all of 2020, the QAnon persona, which was by that point posting on a different board called 8kun, which is set up very similarly to 4chan, was beating a drum for a singular narrative, that Donald Trump was the greatest president in the history of the universe, that there was absolutely no possibility that he could lose an election to the decrepit, basement-bound husk of Joe Biden, and that the only way that Biden could appear to win is if there was massive systemic fraud. Well, how do you have massive systemic fraud? You get people to mail in their votes, and you get rid of the ones for Trump, and you duplicate the ones for Biden. So the whole pandemic, all of that was done to push mail-in voting, to prop up the basement-bound husk of Joe Biden, to give him a chance against the heroic Adonis-like Donald Trump. So for a year, Q is telling their acolytes, the election's going to be stolen, there's going to be massive fraud, here's what to look for, here's what they're doing, here's how they're doing it, this is what's going to happen. Now, that's not happening in a vacuum, because Donald Trump and his inner circle are saying the exact same things. They're talking about how the mail-in ballots are going to be fraudulent, how there's going to be middle-of-the-night ballot dumps, how there's no possible way that Biden can win, that Biden is hiding, he's sleepy, he's barely alive, he's barely awake, all of these things, setting their followers up for the inevitable loss of Donald Trump. Because, of course, as we know, the polling wasn't really that close. Joe Biden was always beating Trump in general election polling. Trump was historically unpopular. The economy was under siege. The pandemic was everywhere. This is not the recipe for a re-election. So Biden's win is really not that outlandish, but they had to come up with a reason why the election would be stolen from Trump, and they came up with this incredibly complicated fraud scheme that they were going to have to appear to lose in order to expose the fraud. But everything would be okay because they'd sue, they'd get it to the Supreme Court. None of that happened. And then at the last minute, Mike Pence was the Hail Mary. He would be handed the envelopes with the electoral votes, and he'd say, no, I don't accept these, and he'd throw them away, and he'd gavel in Donald Trump as reelected. Of course, that's all fantasy. None of that is possible. But by the time we got to January 6th, millions of people believed not only that it was possible, but that it was inevitable.
Well, excuse me, and it's not just, pardon me, not just that it was possible, but that essentially actually happened here in the United States in the election of 1876.
Right.
You had Sam Tilden, the Democrat, who actually got more electoral college votes and won the popular vote, and yet Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, became president. And the reason why was because you had 3 states in the South and Oregon. The 3 states in the South were still occupied by the Union Army. Oregon was occupied by the Klan. And those 4 states each one submitted 2 sets of electors to the Electoral College. One saying Tilden was the winner, one saying Hayes was the winner. And so, I mean, there's a whole bunch of hoops that got jumped through in the middle here. But the bottom line was it got thrown to Congress, and Congress had the power to simply say, okay, you know, we're going to accept these states, we're not going to accept those states, or we're going to vote this way, essentially, you know, for the Electoral College. And I mean, I was writing about that a year before, about the election of 1876, a year before the election of 2020. And I don't think anybody was taking it seriously. And I was saying, no, I'm hearing that this is actually the plan, that you know, the election of, you know, which by the way, the reason that Hayes got in was they decided to just stab African Americans in the back, you know, end Reconstruction. Right. And that was the deal. So there was a historical narrative there that was not totally crazy. Right. And I think at that point, you have a lot of people who cannot conceive of what is going to happen next, because I think a lot of scholars, a lot of pundits, we tend to think that the next war is going to look just like the last war. I mean, if you look at the difference between World War II and World War I, France thought that they were going to fight Germany the same way they fought them in the Great War. Well, Germany had other ideas. And this is how these things work. The people who do these things, the people who seize power in these ways, they think about what is possible and what they can do that nobody else is thinking about. And the rest of us are going, well,
it's never happened before, so it can't happen. And then when something that has never happened before happens, we don't think to ourselves, we really missed that one. We create conspiracy theories to explain why this thing that never happened is not actually what happened. We fool ourselves into letting ourselves off the hook. And I think one of the things that was going on during the election, during the 2020 election, is we weren't paying attention to what these people were saying and how they were positioning themselves. We didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but I could tell, and I think you could tell, and a lot of people who research and write about disinformation and conspiracy theories, people could tell something was going on. And you could tell in the lead up to January 6th, these things were not secret. They weren't hidden. They weren't using codes and ciphers. They were talking about this stuff openly. Donald Trump was inviting people to come to Washington, D.C. and crash the counting of the electoral votes. None of these things were secret. We just weren't taking them seriously because we still think that things that happen on the internet, things that fringe people are talking about, are never actually going to happen, so we don't need to amplify those things. Yeah. Well, I think in some cases we do.
Well, I'm still scratching my head, Mike Rothschild, over why I was able to read on Facebook and Twitter that there was going to be a hell of a fight on January 6th, that the plan was to get Mike Pence to not certify the election, that was the whole focus of the whole thing, that on the morning of January 6th, and we now know that the Park Police had arrested a couple of people and they had a mob coming after them. I mean, these people were already out there. And for some reason, the Chris was it Chris Miller? Mm-hmm. I think it is the guy that Trump had put in charge of the Defense Department temporarily wrote this memo saying you can't help out the Capitol Police without my permission, and for 4 hours he was basically ignoring pleas. Had QAnon? I mean, was this a Trump coup attempt or a QAnon coup attempt? How entangled are these things? What percentage of the people who showed up on January 6th were driven there by Q as opposed to driven there by Trump? Or was at that point, those two movements, were they functionally indistinguishable?
They were functionally indistinguishable. They were completely enmeshed at that point. You really could not be a QAnon believer at that point and think that the election was legitimate. And you had a lot of people there. I mean, certainly you had the Q shaman and the guy who busted in first wearing the Q T-shirt. So the number of people who were there who would say, I am a Q believer, I have read the drops, I read the gurus, that was probably fairly low. But the number of people who were there because the election was illegitimate, because Trump was the real president, because of the deep state, that was 100%. And those are the tenets of QAnon. These are people who maybe didn't know what Q was or didn't subscribe to or thought it was just a bunch of boomers on their couch. That doesn't really matter. At that point, these movements are completely enmeshed together, right, so that you have a movement of people there who are genuinely trying to break into the Capitol to, effect a citizen's arrest on Mike Pence, to, publicly execute Nancy Pelosi. That's what one of these people was talking about, was shooting Nancy Pelosi in the head. These people are driven by this conspiracy ideology of we are going to remake the world as we want it to be. We do not accept the onslaught of progressivism. We do not accept the norms and the rules and the laws that have governed everything up until that point. We are going to create it anew, the same way that Donald Trump said he was going to rebuild the administrative state in his own image. They're completely enmeshed.
Just for historical context, can you talk about the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the Russian, the Tsar's intelligence service in the early, the first decade or two of the 20th century, and how that was used to ultimately kill 6 million Jews in Germany?
Sure. So the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was this forged document where there's absolutely no doubt it was a forgery. We know exactly where it came from. But it became a touchstone for how wealthy Jews were perceived in the 20th century as this insider cabal that didn't let in outsiders, that intermarried with each other, that had strange customs and a strange language, and suddenly had this domination over banking and finance and then the entertainment industry. these tropes, were around long before then. You go back to the blood libel of the 1200s, where a English boy was murdered, and the local villagers thought it was this cabal of Jews that did it, to drink his blood and use it in their matzah. Now, of course, we see that in QAnon. We see the adrenochrome idea, this idea that the elites are keeping themselves alive with the adrenaline of terrified children. It's just another version of the blood libel. And then the tenets of QAnon are really a repackaging of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, of one of the other foundational documents of anti-Semitism, the Satan pamphlet of the 1830s, which posited that Nathan Rothschild, I'm not a member of the Rothschild banking family, just get that out of the way also.
For the record.
For the record. Nobody believes me anyway, but that Nathan Rothschild was there at the Battle of Waterloo, and he braved a Channel storm to get back to the London Stock Exchange and convince everybody that Napoleon had won, but it was really the British had won, and he made millions and millions and millions off it. None of this stuff is real. But those documents are recirculated over and over and over again. They form the core of Nazi propaganda leading up to the Holocaust. They form the core of John Birch propaganda. You had the Protocols of the Elders of Zion reprinted in the seminal conspiracy theory book, Behold a Pale Horse, which in and of itself contains a number of concepts that would later be recycled as QAnon. All of these things are just repackaged over and over and over and over again. We know where they come from. We know how they've been used. But they are compelling to a new generation of anti-Semites who are looking for people to blame that things haven't gone their way. And wealthy Jews are always going to be a perfect scapegoat because of that outsider status, because of their strange customs and their strange language. We are still dealing with the things that made the protocols, the Satan pamphlet, the blood libel. We're still dealing with all of those things that made those things so popular.
Mike, we have 30 seconds to the break. To what extent do you think anti-Semitism is a driving force within QAnon and racism more generally?
It's an enormous driver. The second ever Q drop contains a reference to George Soros. There are Q drops that list nothing but Rothschild-owned central banks. I mean, never mind, that's not how banking works. One of the Q drops reprints a horribly anti-Semitic cartoon that was put on 4chan. This stuff is everywhere. This idea that Barack Obama is an outsider. They refer to him as Hussein. Racism, anti-Semitism, these are cornerstones of the QAnon movement.
Conversations with Great Minds. The book is The Storm is Upon Us, the author Mike Rothschild. Mike, to what extent, the hot thing right now is people showing up at school board meetings, screaming obscenities, and we know where you live, people threatening the lives of election officials, volunteers. My mom used to do this. When I was 7 years old, I used to go to the local elementary school and stand, sit next door to my mom while she checked in voters, right? I mean, it's just civic duty, right? And now, showing up at hospitals, and harassing employees and claiming that there's nobody in that hospital, the parking lot's empty, and all this weird stuff that is becoming, in many cases, frighteningly violent. What is the relationship between that and QAnon?
So all of this really started during the pandemic. You had this sudden event that changed everything. It sent everybody inside. Our understanding of the virus was changing day by day. Events like that are petri dishes for conspiracy theories, especially when you involve health and health freedom and the idea of forced testing and masks and things like that. There are always going to be people who think that they are above the rules, that they are special, that they don't need to do the things that the rest of us are doing, that they're awake. So during the pandemic, these worlds all came together on social media. So people who were not right-wing people who were not Trump supporters or Q people would go online because they had questions about 5G internet and the pandemic, Bill Gates, vaccines, whether it was a Chinese bioweapon, all of these questions that people didn't have answers to. So they would go online, they would look for like-minded communities of people who are talking about the same thing because they have no real-life outlet to talk about this. And to have their friends or colleagues say, yeah, that's probably nothing, don't worry about it, let's go get a beer. None of that was happening during the lockdown. So people went online, and you would find the anti-5G Facebook group. And you'd say, oh, that looks interesting. I have some questions about that. You join that. The algorithm then knows, oh, you are against 5G. Maybe you're also against Bill Gates. It gives you a Bill Gates Facebook group to join. Then it says, oh, maybe you're anti-vaccine. and it gives you an anti-vaccine group, and then it gives you a Great Awakening group, and that's QAnon. So people who consider themselves progressive, Bernie Sanders voters in a lot of cases, were suddenly getting radicalized into QAnon through these health freedom conspiracy theories, the forced vaccination, the big pharma conspiracy, all that stuff. Then in the summer of 2020, they start marching. They start marching to save the children. And they're doing that because Q promoters have started to drop the branding of QAnon because it's getting banned on social media. So they find something they can co-opt that is not going to be banned and that you can't reasonably be against. Most people do not want children to be trafficked. That's not an unreasonable thing. So these people go and they start marching, and all of these worlds combine in these protests that seem very amorphous, very listless. People are just sort of marching around and they're just angry. They're angry about lockdown.
Well, this was Pizzagate too, was it? Was it not?
It's absolutely Pizzagate. That is 100% a part of it. So all of these people have suddenly become enmeshed in this very amorphous conspiracy movement. Then the election happens, and now these people are completely primed to think that the election was stolen. And then we get into the Biden administration, and suddenly these people realize that QAnon is not there anymore. There's no new Q drops. They need to channel this into something else. And you start to see a real groundswell in QAnon of local action. Mike Flynn has this statement where he says, local action has a national impact. So people start to go to these places that they feel like are influencing what's going on in their communities as part of the pandemic. So they see the mask mandates, they see vaccine mandates, they see schools being closed, and they want to fight against that. And they figure out that the way to do that is to show up at these meetings and be really loud, go viral for your bizarre rants, and suddenly you can be at a school board meeting in some rural county, and your Facebook video of you ranting about George Soros and vaccines gets 2 million views. And then suddenly people start talking to you about running for office. And these elections, as you know, are very low turnout. Most people are not interested in them. Most people don't really know who's on their school board or their city council. We're too focused on national politics to know what's going on in our community. So these elections are very winnable. They're low turnout. They don't cost a lot of money. If you have name recognition, you can win. Well, what gets you name recognition in a community of energized conservatives but a viral video of you screaming about conspiracy theories? So all of this stuff is interlinked. It's all enmeshed. It all feeds off each other.
Wow. We have about 2 minutes left, Mike. Where did Q go? You said Q stopped Q dropping. Who was Q and where did Q go?
Well, the prevailing theory among most disinformation journalists is that the person making the drops at the end of Q was this guy, Ron Watkins. And this is a name you've probably seen thrown around. He was one of the stars of the HBO documentary. He is the son of the pig farmer who lived in the Philippines. Now, he's not a pig farmer. He sold the farm. He doesn't even live there anymore. I think he lives in Sacramento. But this guy really is the prime suspect for having made the Q drops. Well, he stopped making them in December, and he started tweeting out under his own name. And he refashioned himself as an expert on election fraud because he read the manual for a Dominion voting machine. So he is now relentlessly tweeting exactly how these Dominion voting machines are vulnerable, how their votes can be switched, how they're hooked up to the internet. None of that stuff is true. He has no idea what he's talking about. But in those desperate weeks after Trump lost the election, people are looking for anything that explains to them what really happened. So Ron Watkins becomes a new media star. He's getting retweeted by Donald Trump. He's getting interviewed live on OAN. He is presenting himself as somebody who knows how this stuff works. So he's now a right-wing celebrity. He doesn't need Q anymore. He's getting retweeted by the president. He's getting mentioned in Sidney Powell's lawsuits. He's left that behind. He's moved away from the small town, and he's in the big city. Once you're in the big city, you don't need the small town anymore. So that's really, at least for me, where I think Q is gone and why I don't think there will be any more Q drops. The person behind them does not need to be anonymous anymore. There's no value in that anymore.
Has Dominion gone after him? I mean, they're suing a bunch of people.
They're suing a bunch of people. He is not, as far as I know, in any direct legal jeopardy, but I think the ball is still very much in their court as to what they're going to do about him.